The sun was waning, its light filtered through the wispy veils of Scottish mist. I had returned to my humble cottage, exhausted from a day of relentless inquiry and ceaseless pondering. Will any of this matter if I can't find a way to stop the malevolent? Just as I sank into the tattered armchair beside the hearth, I heard the all-too-familiar rustling of paper push through the mail slot. I sighed, walking over to pick it up. My fingers trembled as I read the sender's information. Official military correspondence. It was a letter regarding Douglas, my childhood friend who had gone missing in action 2 years ago during the early days of the war. As I scanned the words, my heart sank. Douglas had been confirmed dead. The details were sparse but punctuated by a sense of finality. Even the horrors of war can't escape me here. As if to mirror my despondence, the door rattled with a sequence of urgent knocks. I got up, placing the letter on the table, my heart heavy but my posture erect. There was work to be done. Opening the door, I found Lieutenant Harris, one of the officers from the regiment recently stationed in our village. His eyes were fraught with a mix of curiosity and caution. "Good evening, Mr. O'Sullivan. May we come in? There's a matter of significant import we must discuss." The "we" referred to the cadre of soldiers flanking him, their expressions as serious as his. "Of course, Lieutenant. Please, make yourselves at home." They filed in, removing their caps and scanning the room, perhaps assessing its strategic value or estimating its owner's character. "Sir, our regiment has encountered some irregularities since our arrival here," Harris began. "Missing rations, inexplicable tracks, and, as you likely know, vanishing villagers. Captain Anderson believes these occurrences may be interconnected." So the army is finally acknowledging the menace. "And what do you want from me?" "We've heard whispers, Mr. O'Sullivan. Whispers about something called WWII. We require your expertise on this lore. Time is of the essence, and we wish to apprehend this entity before more lives are lost." They were skeptical but desperate, wary of folklore yet bereft of alternatives. "Very well," I conceded. "But know this. What you're dealing with is beyond the comprehension of conventional warfare. If we're to get ahead of this, we'll need more than bullets and bravado." "Understood." Harris nodded gravely. "And what would you propose?" I walked over to the shelf containing various heirlooms and artifacts from earlier, simpler times. I picked up an ancient, dust-laden book, its pages yellowed but its wisdom unyielding. "This is where we start," I said, laying it on the table. "Knowledge is our primary weapon. Learn this, and we may stand a chance." Each soldier peered at the book, then back at me, their eyes filled with a blend of incredulity and budding respect. "Very well, Mr. O'Sullivan. We shall commence this unconventional warfare immediately." As they left, filing out with a newfound sense of purpose, I couldn't shake off the weight of my recent loss, the haunting memories of Douglas, and the uncertain path that lay ahead. The war is here, in this village, in the very air we breathe, and it's a war unlike any other. The ancient tome lay open on the wooden table, its fragile pages trembling in the breeze that wafted through the open window. The soldiers from the regiment had returned to their makeshift base, leaving me to explore the cryptic insights within the time-worn book. The solution to our dire predicament might very well lie within these pages. Fingers careful not to damage the paper, I skimmed through archaic texts and elaborate etchings until my eyes landed on a chapter detailing weapons of mythical properties. It was then that the true significance of silver in combating supernatural creatures, particularly werewolves, became strikingly evident. Silver bullets. How could I have been so naive? Closing the book and sliding it back onto the shelf, I donned my coat and made my way to Robert's smithy, the village blacksmith. The night was closing in. Darkness draped over the land like a shroud. I couldn't waste any more time. The smithy was aglow, with amber light dancing across the walls as Robert toiled away. I opened the door, the metallic scent of molten metal hitting me instantly. "Evening, John. What brings you here so late?" Robert asked, wiping his brow with a soot-streaked arm. I need your expertise, Robert, and discretion. I require bullets, but not just any bullets, silver bullets. Robert paused, hammer hovering above the anvil, eyes narrowing. Silver bullets, you say? Ye dinna mean for huntin', the madad alaith? Exactly, I have no other choice. The room grew still, the weight of my words hanging heavily in the air. All right, but silver's scarce these days, what with a war and all. I have some heirloom silverware, it should suffice. The circumstances demand sacrifice. Robert nodded, laying down his hammer. Very well, but mind you, these bullets won't come cheap. Neither does the cost of doing nothing, I replied, a palpable tension settling between us. We spent the next several hours melting down the ornate silverware, casting it into lethal bullets. As we worked, Robert shared stories of his grandfather, who had also believed in the old myths and had even claimed to have seen the Madad Alaith in his youth. Could this cursed history be far older than even the village elders care to admit? Finally, as dawn threatened to break, the last of the bullets solidified in their molds. You best hope you never have to use these, John. But if you do, aim true, Robert said, handing me a leather pouch filled with freshly forged silver bullets. I will. And Robert, thank you. I returned home just as the first light of day was washing over the village, illuminating the path before me in more ways than one. It's a path fraught with peril, each step steeped in dread, but it's one I must walk. The walls of the old town hall were bathed in the muted hues of afternoon light filtering through stained glass windows. The villagers had been summoned, as had the soldiers, for an emergency town meeting. The air was thick with a blend of tension and anticipation, the grim silence punctuated only by the shuffling of feet and the occasional whisper. This is where we chart our course, for better or worse. Captain Anderson, the regiment commander, stood at the podium, his piercing eyes surveying the room before settling on me. I felt the weight of those gazes, from both villagers and soldiers, bearing down on me. Good afternoon, the captain began, his voice a resonant timbre that filled the hall. We are gathered here today because of a crisis that befalls us all, a crisis that transcends the boundaries of reason and science. He paused, allowing his words to hang in the air before continuing. We have been told stories of the so-called Madad Alaith, a creature of local myth. While I am naturally inclined to regard such tales as the fabrications of idle minds, the evidence, or rather, the lack of contrary evidence, suggests otherwise. A low murmur rippled through the crowd, a mixture of vindication and dread. Therefore, we propose an alliance between the armed forces of this kingdom and the good people of this village, to apprehend and eliminate this threat. He turned towards me. Mr. O'Sullivan, will you come forward? I made my way up, each step echoing through the hall like a drumbeat. The captain extended his hand, and I shook it, sensing the gravity of this public gesture. John O'Sullivan has offered to provide us with invaluable information. Moreover, he has already begun preparations for an armed response, crafting silver bullets in the belief that they possess the capability to eliminate this beast. If they only knew how much faith we're placing in ancient folklore. Tonight, a scouting party comprised of soldiers and volunteers will venture into the forest. They will be led by Mr. O'Sullivan and Lieutenant Harris. We will scout for evidence and, God willing, put an end to this reign of terror. Those willing to volunteer, step forward, I added, scanning the crowd. The room was motionless for a moment that felt like an eternity. Finally, a few brave souls began to step forward, including Robert the blacksmith. Our objective is clear, our resolve, unyielding, Captain Anderson concluded, his words imbued with a solemnity that seemed to elevate the room's mood. We convene at dusk. Until then, may God be with us all. As the crowd dispersed, their faces etched with varying degrees of concern and resolve, I felt a new burden settle on my shoulders, a burden of leadership, of lives, depending on my guidance. This is no longer a solitary quest. It's a communal struggle. The web of destiny weaves ever more complex patterns, binding us all in its intricate design. Under the shroud of impending dusk, the once tranquil village of Ceann Fàilte stood ominously still. We were a cadre of the brave, congregating at the threshold of the woods that loomed like a dark behemoth at our borders. Lieutenant Harris, with a face chiseled from stone and shadows, checked the chamber of his rifle, a gesture of readiness and a ritual of comfort. To the heart of darkness, we march. The moon shall be our torch in the gloom, I murmured, my voice scarcely a ripple in the charged air. He replied with a terse nod. It is the silver you've provided that will see us through this night, O'Sullivan. Let's hope your faith in the old tales holds true. The forest swallowed us whole, our figures enveloped by the dense arms of ancient oaks. The ambiance of the night was a living entity, the chorus of nocturnal creatures, the rustle of leaves beneath our cautious steps. The very essence of the woods breathed an elegy for the unsung. Our march was a timeless ordeal, every moment an eternity as the moon ascended to its throne above. Suddenly, Robert's grip, cold and urgent, latched onto my arm, pulling me into a frozen stillness. John, do you feel it? He whispered, his voice barely carrying over the pulse of the night. A halt was signaled, and silence fell upon us, heavy and expectant. A guttural growl unfurled from the darkness, a symphony of dread that embraced us without touch. The soldiers shouldered their rifles, eyes darting with primal instinct. The villagers, armed with an array of inherited weaponry, held their breaths and their ground. The growl grew into a roar, a declaration of a nightmare made flesh. Then it appeared. The werewolf, a behemoth of myth, a creature woven from the very fabric of horror. Its fur, a tapestry of shadows and moonlight, matted with the ichor of its past prey. Its eyes, twin coals set within the depths of hell itself, fixed us with a hatred as old as the cursed soil it tread upon. Our guns roared to life, a desperate orchestra of defiance. The beast weaved through the hail of bullets, its form an aberration of speed and malice. With a fury that spoke of ancient wars and primal wrath, it descended upon us. Our ranks broke as the werewolf tore through flesh and bone with demonic precision. Blood, the essence of life, was splattered across the undergrowth, painting the moor in hues of despair. I found my moment amidst the carnage, the revolver a heavy presence in my trembling hands. Aiming with an uncanny calm, I fired. The silver bullet, a whisper of death, sped through the chaos. The impact was a crescendo of agony and rage, the werewolf's howl a requiem that pierced the veil of the night. It staggered, the purity of silver anathema to its cursed existence, and retreated into the labyrinth of trees from which it had sprung. We were left amidst a tableau of valor and horror, the ground consecrated by the blood of the fallen, the air rent with the cries of the wounded. The moon bore witness to our bitter victory, its luminescence an austere light upon the savaged moors. "We'll head back," Lieutenant Harris declared, his voice the sound of gravestones in the wind. "Dawn will bring its own challenges." The return was a procession of ghosts, each man haunted by the night's revelations. We had glimpsed the abyss, danced with the specters of our fears, and emerged alive, but forever changed. The werewolf had been wounded, but our victory was Pyrrhic. The night was far from over, and the darkness, now tasted blood, would hunger again. The return to Ceann Fàilte was marked by an oppressive silence, one that spoke of the unspeakable terror we had just survived. The sky began to show the earliest signs of dawn, a cruel reminder that our confrontation had consumed an entire night. Wounded men were carried on makeshift stretchers, their moans a constant echo of the night's savagery. In the command center, now the village inn, maps and strategies were laid out like a grim game whose stakes were the highest conceivable. Lieutenant Harris, with a new set of lines etched into his face, spoke with somber authority. "We'll fortify the perimeter. If that thing returns, we'll be ready." When it returns. As dawn gave way to morning, I found myself outside Margaret's door, my hand hesitant to knock. She had lost her brother to the beast. The sorrow that awaited behind that door was as palpable as the chill in the air. I was ushered into a room where grief hung heavy, an unwanted mantle that smothered all within. Margaret sat, her eyes hollow from weeping. "John, it took Robbie. It took him, and we couldn't stop it." I sat beside her, my own heart a tempest of anger and loss. "We'll find a way, Margaret. We have to believe that Robbie's death won't be in vain." The day was spent in a flurry of activity, every villager a participant in a desperate bid for survival. Barricades rose, ancient firearms were cleaned and loaded, and every piece of silver in the village was melted down for ammunition. By afternoon, the skies turned, as if sensing our plight. Dark clouds rolled over Ceann Fàilte, and a storm began to brew, the wind carrying whispers of the coming night. The hours passed with the tension of a drawn bow. As evening approached, the villagers gathered in the local chapel, seeking solace in prayer and the strength of community. I stood among them, a shared resolve fortifying our spirits. This night will be different. It has to be. Nightfall brought with it the storm's crescendo, thunder mirroring the turmoil within us. The wind howled like a banshee, an aria to the madness that encroached. And then, with the ferocity of a cannonade, rain began to fall, as if the heavens themselves sought to cleanse the earth of the abomination that hunted us. But the werewolf was no mere beast to be deterred by rain or resolve. As the first howl cut through the storm, every heart in Ceann Fàilte clenched with dread. We manned our posts, the barricades our last line of defense. Lieutenant Harris, drenched and resolute, gave the nod. We were ready to fight, to protect our home against the darkness that loped ever closer. This is our stand, for Robbie, for all we've lost. The night was upon us, and with it, the true test of our mettle. The storm outside was fierce, but it paled in comparison to the one that was about to break within the boundaries of our beleaguered village. The chapel bell tolled, not to signal the hour, but as a clarion, call to arms. Its resonant booms melded with the cacophony of the storm, creating a soundscape of apocalyptic fervor. Villagers, whose hands were more accustomed to the plow than the pistol, stood shoulder to shoulder with battle-weary soldiers. Each face, intermittently lit by the violent strobes of lightning, was a tapestry of grim resolve. Inside the makeshift command post, Lieutenant Harris and I pored over the village layout once more. The map was a lattice of our desperation. Red lines for barricades, blue for fallback points. "We'll make our stand here and here," he said, his finger stabbing at the central square and then the chapel. "If we fall back, the chapel will serve as our final redoubt." Outside, the barricades stood as bulwarks against the impending onslaught. Men and women worked feverishly, reinforcing the structures with whatever was at hand. The pounding of hammers against wood was punctuated by the clattering of pots and pans, as children collected the remnants of silverware to be melted into ammunition. The air was heavy with the scent of wet earth and the metallic tang of anticipation. I watched as Margaret, her mourning shroud discarded for the armor of purpose, directed younger villagers in the preparation of Molotov cocktails. "Fire may not kill it," she said, determination hardening her features, "but it will give the beast pause." As dusk morphed into the inky blackness of night, the storm's wrath intensified. The rain, now a torrential downpour, turned the ground into a mire, hindering movement but offering a sliver of hope that the creature's assaults would be similarly hampered. Let the earth itself rise against this abomination. The first sign of the werewolf was not a sight nor sound, but a cessation of the wind, as though nature itself held its breath. Then, A silhouette materialized at the edge of the woods, a form too large to be a man, too grotesque to belong to any earthly creature. Our line braced as the beast charged, its form a blur against the latticework of rain. The first volley of gunfire erupted, a staccato of flashes that cut through the darkness. Silver bullets, our hopes incarnate, hurtled toward the advancing nightmare. The werewolf was undeterred, its body weaving with an unnatural agility. Bullets found their mark, eliciting roars of rage as silver seared its flesh. But still, it came. It collided with the barricade, a battering ram of muscle and fury splintering the wood like kindling. Panic threatened to take root as the line wavered under the assault. "Hold fast!" Harris bellowed, his voice a rallying cry against the terror. It was then that Margaret's concoction proved its worth. A Molotov cocktail arced through the air, shattering against the beast's shoulder, engulfing it in flames. The werewolf recoiled, its howls now a medley of pain and anger, as fire consumed fur and flesh. Emboldened, our line surged forward, firing with renewed vigor. The werewolf, a pyre of living flame, retreated into the storm, leaving a trail of smoldering earth in its wake. We dared not cheer our reprieve. The beast was wounded, not vanquished. Its cries, retreating into the woods, were a promise of retribution. In the lull that followed, we fortified our position, dragging the remnants of the barricade into a semblance of defense. Each face I saw was etched with the same knowledge. The werewolf would return before the night was through, and our survival hung by the barest of threads. As the storm raged above, we waited, our weapons clutched like lifelines, knowing that the next assault would determine the fate of our village, our loved ones, and the very essence of our souls. The waning moon, obscured by scudding clouds, cast the village of Ceann Fàilte into a tableau of half-light and shadow. An eerie quiet suffused the night, broken only by the occasional hoot of a distant owl or the nervous shuffle of feet behind the barricades. Every villager's breath was a plume of vapor in the chill air, their collective anxiety a near palpable shroud enshrouding the hamlet. The defenders' eyes, wide and watchful, flitted across the darkened heath where the heather and gorse intermingled with the shadows cast by the firelight. Each rifle barrel gleamed with a lethal sheen, every weapon a promise of resistance against the encroaching terror. Beside me, a young lad, no more than 16, gripped his grandfather's rifle with knuckles white as the waxen moon above. His eyes, reflecting a primal fear, sought mine for reassurance I was ill-equipped to give. The beast's first assault came as a discordant chorus of howls that split the night asunder. The eerie ululations were at once foreign and all too familiar, a reminder of the unnatural foe we faced. They echoed from the depths of the rolling moorland, a symphony of dread that preceded the onslaught. A silence followed, suffocating in its intensity, as if the very earth held its breath. Then, a fusillade of movement erupted from the tree line, a surge of dark shapes that descended upon the village with preternatural speed. The werewolf, its silhouette a massive, contorted shadow against the flickering fires, led the charge. Its eyes, lambent with a malevolent intelligence, seemed to fixate on the heart of our defenses. The air was rent by the cacophony of gunfire, each shot a punctuated plea for survival. Lead and silver bullets tore through the night, seeking flesh and fur in a desperate bid to stem the tide. The metallic tang of blood mingled with the acrid bite of black powder, cloying in the throat and nostrils. Villagers cried out as lesser beasts. Minions in the werewolf's grotesque retinue breached the barricades. Claws, like knives of bone, rended wood and sinew alike. The rifle in the lad's hands roared, its payload catching a shadowy figure full in the chest. It fell, writhing and snarling, only to be replaced by another of its ilk. Lieutenant Harris, his countenance a mask of stoic terror, fired and reloaded with mechanical precision, each round sent with silent prayer. Margaret, her hair come undone and face smeared with soot, wielded her shotgun like an avenging angel, each blast felling another of the lesser wolves that accompanied their dark master. The werewolf itself seemed a creature born of nightmare, impervious to our feeble attempts to harm it. It moved with a horrifying grace, its body a maelstrom of sinew and muscle under moonlit fur. A defender's pitchfork plunged into the beast's flank, eliciting a roar that shook the very stones of Ceann Fàilte. Yet it did not fall. Instead, it turned, its jaws agape in a snarl, and the pitchfork, along with the man who held it, were summarily ripped in half with a spray of crimson carnage. Amidst the chaos, as a rallying cry rose from the throats of the besieged villagers, I found myself face to face with the beast. Its breath was a fetid gale, its eyes two orbs of infernal light boring into mine. In that moment, frozen between heartbeats, I understood the true terror of the wild, a primal fear that seized the marrow and chilled the blood. With a strength born of desperation and terror, I thrust my bayonet forward, the silvered edge of the blade catching the firelight as it sought the heart of the werewolf. The beast's reaction was immediate and ferocious, its claw swiping with a force that turned the world into a maelstrom of pain and vertigo. The battle raged until the moon's passage marked the approach of dawn. With the retreat of the shadows, the creatures withdrew, melting into the forest as specters at the coming of the light. We, the living, remained in the aftermath, surrounded by the detritus of the night's horror. The siege of Ceann Fàilte had deepened its mark upon us, each survivor etched with the grim knowledge that the battle was far from over. The werewolf, a relentless scourge, would return with the night, and we would stand ready, or we would perish. In the wan light of dawn, the village lay shrouded in a grim silence, the kind that follows the storm of battle, saturated with the unspeakable. The night's terrors had retreated, but their shadow lingered over the village like a pall. The air was still thick with the stench of gunpowder and blood, and the moor's heather was trampled and stained in a macabre testament to the night's ferocity. The survivors moved among the wreckage, and the fallen with a hollow determination. Weary hands dragged away debris, tended to the wounded, and, with heavy hearts, laid out the dead. The villagers spoke little, their words unnecessary amidst the shared language of grief and the unspoken resolve that fortified their weary spirits. In the aftermath, I found myself standing at the edge of the moor, gazing into the forest where the werewolf and its minions had vanished. The trees stood as silent sentinels, their secrets cloaked within the shadows of their boughs. Somewhere within that inscrutable darkness, our nemesis lurked, nursing its malice until the night would fall again. The day passed with the slow crawl of a dirge. We fortified the barricades with what little strength and resources remained. The blacksmith, his arms like wrought iron from years at the forge, hammered out crude silver spikes and bullets, each one an offering to our desperate cause. I spent the hours in a fitful rest, my dreams haunted by fangs and fur and eyes that glowed with a demonic fire. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back on the battlefield, feeling the hot breath of the beast, its claws inches from my flesh. I woke to the sounds of hammers and saws, the village bracing for the inevitable return of our tormentor. As dusk approached, a heavy fog rolled in from the sea, enveloping the village in a thick, spectral mist. It clung to every surface, seeping into every nook and cranny, as if the very atmosphere sought to smother us in its cold embrace. The setting sun, a dim orb shrouded in mist, provided no comfort, its dying light a harbinger of the darkness to come. The villagers, their faces drawn and eyes haunted, gathered within the defenses. Some turned to their faith, murmuring prayers that mingled with the fog. Others checked their weapons, their actions mechanical, driven by a grim resolve rather than hope. As the last vestiges of daylight succumbed to the encroaching night, the villagers of Ceann Fàilte steeled themselves. The wounded, bandaged, and braced were settled into the chapel, now a makeshift infirmary and sanctuary. The able-bodied took their positions, their grips on rifles and makeshift weapons tightened against the chill that seeped into their bones. The night descended in full, the fog an opaque veil that obscured the moon and stars. We were blind within our own walls, the darkness and mist conspiring to cloak the approach of death itself. In that blindness, every sound became a portent of attack. The rustle of wind through the heather, the distant cry of an animal, the soft drip of condensation from the fog-laden air. And then, silence, profound and pressing. The waiting began anew, a torture of anticipation that frayed the edges of the bravest souls. In the hush, I found my own breath ragged, my heart a drumbeat thundering in my ears. The werewolf was out there, in the dark, in the fog, a specter of nightmare poised to breach the veil between dusk and doom. In the quiet before the storm, I grasped the rifle with hands that were no longer steady. The memory of the previous night's carnage, a grim promise of the horror to come. The siege of Ceann Fàilte was far from over, and the night held no refuge from the horrors birthed by the moon over the moors. The curtain of night was drawn tight, and the village huddled beneath it, bracing against the unseen. Our every sense was strained to its limit. Every rustle or snap of heather was a potential harbinger of doom. The fog, thick and unyielding, had transformed the moor into an alien landscape, and we, the remaining villagers, were but strangers in it. I stood sentinel at a parapet, the chill of the stone seeping through my clothing. The mist curled around my fingers, an icy specter as I clutched my rifle. We all knew the attack would come. It was only a question of when. The hours stretched on, the silence as taut as a bowstring. Suddenly, a low growl rumbled through the fog, so deep it was felt rather than heard, vibrating through the earth and the soles of our boots. It was met by a chorus of snarls and the unmistakable sound of heavy bodies moving swiftly through the bracken. The creatures of the night were no longer lingering in the shadows. They were on the move. The first howl shattered the quiet, a sound so desolate and filled with hunger it seemed to pull the very warmth from my blood. It echoed off the walls of Ceann Fàilte, a clarion call that sparked a primal fear in all of us. More howls joined in, a symphony of nightmares drawing closer with every haunting note. Flares shot into the sky, their sizzling ascent cutting through the fog to burst overhead in blooms of red and white light. The world was abruptly drawn in stark relief, the moor a landscape of long shadows and fleeing figures. The werewolf's pack, caught in the glare, hesitated, their eyes reflecting the light like devilish lanterns. The werewolf itself was a specter, seen only in glimpses, a shadow within shadows, its size and power suggested rather than revealed. Yet, its presence was unmistakable, a force of nature that seemed to bend the very fog to its will. Then, with a howl that seemed to split the very air, they charged. The ground thundered beneath their assault, and the villagers opened fire, the reports of their rifles sharp cracks that overlaid the bestial roars. The fight was chaos given form, a melee where each moment was life or death, and the only certainty was bloodshed. The creatures were relentless, but so were the villagers, each determined to protect their home, their families, their very lives. Silver bullets found their mark, and the first of the beasts fell, a mass of fur and twisted limbs that collapsed with a final, piteous whine. But for each that fell, it seemed two more took its place, their snarls as much a weapon as tooth and claw. The barricades held, but barely, as massive forms hurled themselves against the wood and stone. Axes and pikes lashed out, finding flesh and drawing howls of rage and pain. But the creatures were cunning, and under the direction of the werewolf, they began to test our defenses, seeking weakness. I fired and reloaded, the rifle's kick a steady pulse against my shoulder. Beside me, men and women fought with a ferocity unlike any other, their faces set in grim determination. Each of us knew that if Ceann Fàilte fell, there would be no mercy from the horrors that pressed against us. The attack seemed to last both an eternity and a mere heartbeat. The final flare burned out, plunging the moor back into a darkness that was now filled with the sounds of conflict, the cries of the wounded, the clash of steel, the snarls of beasts. And through it all, the werewolf moved like a wraith, elusive and deadly, its howls a dark command that drove its minions ever forward. The true battle for Ceann Fàilte had begun, and with it, the night turned blood-red beneath the moon's uncaring gaze. As the vestiges of night began to wane, a haunting silence settled over us. The relentless assault of the werewolf and its pack had ebbed with the receding darkness, leaving behind a tableau of defiance and desolation. Dawn approached with a hesitant grace, as if afraid to reveal the horrors the night had borne. The barricades bore the scars of the siege, splintered and soaked with the evidence of the night's savagery. Here and there, the earth was torn, bearing witness to the struggle that had unfolded. Bodies, both human and beastly, lay intermingled, their lifeblood painting the heather a grim shade of crimson. I stepped cautiously from the parapet, my muscles aching from the night's exertions. My breath formed clouds in the chill air, mixing with the lingering mists that the rising sun fought to dispel. The survivors emerged, faces gaunt and etched with fatigue, surveying the aftermath with a dawning realization of the cost. The werewolf, the spectral terror of the night, had vanished with the shadows, leaving us to ponder its absence. Was it a retreat, a regrouping, or a tactic to spread paranoia and fear? None could say, but the pall of its potential return hung over us like a shroud. We set to work. The wounded were tended to with quiet urgency, their moans a somber accompaniment to the morning bird song. The dead were gathered with reverence, their sacrifices not to be forgotten. A pyre was built, a somber monument to their bravery, the smoke of its burning a final salute as it rose to the heavens. As I assisted in the grim tasks, I couldn't help but feel the weight of each life lost, each dream extinguished. These were people I had known my whole life, now reduced to memories in the blink of an eye. We fortified what remained of our defenses, knowing full well that the respite daylight offered was fleeting. Each plank nailed, every stone stacked, was done with the silent acknowledgement that the night would return, and with it, the terror. In the aftermath, there was a grim determination that settled over the survivors. We shared quiet nods, not needing words to express our collective resolve. The werewolf had brought a reckoning to our home, but we would stand firm against the darkness, come what may. Throughout the day, I found myself drawn to the edges of the village, peering into the moors, searching for a sign. But the landscape offered no clues, only the rolling fog and the whisper of the wind through the grass. As the sun arced towards the horizon, casting long shadows across the village, a new plan began to form. We would not simply wait for the next attack. We would seek out this beast, this curse upon our land, and confront it on our terms. The moon would rise again, but perhaps this time, we would be the hunters beneath its baleful glow.